Okay, so in this particular video we're going to start to look at this whole topic of oligopoly, and there's going to be 3 or 4 at least videos on this topic. There's this one, the characteristics and the introduction to oligopoly, then collusion. We'll have a whole video on collusion, whole video on competition, competing, price and non-price, and a video on game theory as well. So basically oligopoly is that the understanding that the whole of the market, the output of the market, is concentrated into the hands of just a few firms. There may be lots of firms operating, so don't say there's only a few firms operating, but out of the whole of those firms that are operating, the output of the market is concentrated into maybe 3 or 4 big firms that they take up the majority of the market share. Okay, so that's important, and in order to therefore work out what that means, because it's a bit nebulous as a concept, you have to work out what they call the concentration ratio. In other words, how much of the market is concentrated into the hands of those few, and I'll look at that in a minute. There's also high barriers to entry and exit, so that means that any profits that are made in these industries can be kept. Okay, so that's another important characteristic. But the biggest one, I think, is that because of the concentration into the hands of a few, they are therefore interdependent. They're not independent. They don't make independent decisions, the firms. They are making their decisions based on what they think the other firms in the market are going to do. And also the product can be differentiated, although we will see in a minute that it might be that the product is homogeneous. So that last one there, the product differentiation, isn't such a strong characteristic, if you like, but the other ones are important ones for you to be able to look at. So let's look at this domination and this concentration, and as I say, what we do is we measure a concentration ratio. Now that is simply this, that the combined market share of some number of firms, let's say 3 firms or 4 firms or 5 firms, doesn't matter, can be different. Okay, what is the combined market share of those firms? So give you an example. If we're looking at a 5 firm concentration ratio of 60%, what that says is that if you added up the market share of the top 5 firms, the biggest 5 firms, you'd start with the biggest firm and how much market share they have, then the second one, then the third, then the fourth, then the fifth. That would add up to 60%, for example. Okay, that could be 62%, could be any number, but we'll see in a minute what we call and what economists tend to agree would give us an oligopoly. So the 5 largest firms give us a combined market share of 60%. That, as a rule of thumb, if you've got a 5 firm ratio of 60% or over 60%, that is often agreed that that's an oligopoly. If you've got 4 firms, 4 big firms operating, and then lots of other little firms, maybe 40% is the number that most economists would agree on. So it is a rule of thumb. There's nothing set in stone here. It's a rule of thumb that that's about right for an oligopoly, for some domination by a few firms in the market. Okay. The product, well, it tends to be differentiated. We've moved on, remember, from monopolistic, and we said, well, look, with monopolistic, you get the idea that the product gets differentiated. When you move from perfect competition to monopolistic, the biggest change is the product gets slightly differentiated, and that's why you've got a downward sloping demand curve. And so this continues that. There tends to be a differentiated product, but there is the possibility of maybe some oligopolistic markets which have homogeneous products. So petrol is an example of an oligopolistic market, but the product itself is homogeneous. So you've got to be careful that if you're arguing something is an oligopoly, that it covers quite a few of the bigger sort of characteristics, and this one would be one that there's a bit of debate about, to be honest. So supermarkets, yeah, brand labels, they differ from general foodstuffs. online, watching films online. That's an oligopolistic market, really. And all the ways that you can do that are slightly different from each other, and it has different characteristics. So mostly we are talking about, as I say, a differentiated product, but not always. You could actually have a homogeneous product. Okay, the biggest one is this one, interdependence. What this means is that up till now we've been arguing that if you've studied perfect competition and then monopolistic competition, you've argued that the firms are independent. They make their own decision. Okay, and I know these markets here, perfect, monopolistic, even monopoly, based on their own costs and revenues. In other words, you said, we make an assumption they're profit maximizers. They said MC equal MR. That sets the quantity. If that sets the quantity, how do we sell the quantity? Go up, find the average revenue curve, come across. That's the average revenue. That's the price that they'll sell that quantity for. And they're independent. They can make that decision themselves. But because of this idea that there's 3, 4, maybe 5 firms that are dominating this market, the argument is that there's interdependent. They're dependent on what the others are going to do. So if one firm changes its price, it makes that decision on the basis of what the other firms are going to do. So they decide on price and output in different ways. Now they can, simply compete. If they're a very large firm, maybe they'll be the major driver of the price and they'll decide on the price, and maybe they'll make an assumption that everyone else is going to follow them, for example. But they're always thinking about what the other firms are going to do. And game theory is a way of looking at this and saying, well, sometimes they collude, they agree on prices, and then they break away and they start to compete on prices. And then they realize that that might not be beneficial for them, so they go back to collusion. So game theory really is a mixture of collusion and competing, and it's a very useful thing to bring in because it can be used as analysis and evaluation in most of your essays in oligopoly. So, but the key is here that it's interdependent. They are working out what the others are going to be doing as a result of what they've done. Sometimes, in times past, we used to call that the reaction function. They work out how the others are going to react to what they do. Okay, many barriers as well. So legal, patents, these sorts of things, really, legitimate legal barriers to entry. They've undertaken a lot of research and development. They want to protect that, and they want to, charge a higher price without people copying their products. But you can get restrictive trade practices and exclusive deals. So that's a problem in terms of oligopoly, and a barrier to entry that some firms can't come in because of these things. Product differentiation and brand loyalty, you can argue, well, that's quite good for consumers sometimes because it gives you a bit of choice on your products. But on the other hand, you could say, well, it's a barrier to entry, so the market isn't going to be as competitive. Advertising, big one. Advertising is often used to make sure that people are buying your product. But if it's a large amount of advertising, the argument is that advertising becomes a big barrier to entry. So advertising, I think, if there's questions on advertising, I always reckon that you should be thinking about what we call informative advertising, which is trying to get rid of the market failure of information gaps, and persuasive advertising, which can build up a barrier to entry. So informative, maybe pretty good, but persuasive advertising, not so good in economics. You can have aggressive marketing, predatory pricing, that's dropping the price in order to force other firms out of the market. And if that happens, then it's a barrier to entry because firms are worried about that, and they might leave the industry or even limit pricing. Firms are thinking of coming into an industry, are planning to come in, and the existing firms will say, we will limit our price, we will drop our price, and you won't be able to make profits in the first couple of years in the industry. So we'll look at those when we do different pricing strategies. Key resources, very good market to look at the moment, I think, is lithium. Because of the electric cars and the build-up of that market, they all need batteries, and they need lithium batteries. So, the control of lithium, the control of the batteries even, is actually quite important. One of the biggest Chinese companies, which has just taken over Tesla in terms of the sales of their, basically their electric cars, they started as a company which was producing electric batteries, and they have their own, so they produce their own electric batteries. They're not having to buy it in from other companies, so their costs are much lower, and that's giving them a really key advantage. And as I say, just at Christmas I read that they have now taken over the top spot from Tesla as the biggest electric car manufacturer in the world. BYD it's called. And research and development spending as well, that can be very positive. You can argue positive for that, in the sense that it's giving you product differentiation and customers are happy with that, but it can become a barrier. If it becomes a barrier, then obviously there's less competition in the market. So there is this overview which I've given you of oligopoly. So we're going through here the characteristics, then we're going to look in the second video at collusion, then we're going to look at competition, okay, and we will have a little look at game theory as well, while in the fourth video in this series. But if you want this as a PDF, I've taken my picture out of this, so you can take a screenshot. But if you want this as a PDF, if you go up here to the Wakelet account, then it's in there for you to download as a PDF as well. So given those characteristics, what we're going to see is that firms will either collude or compete. And if they collude, it can be formal or it can be informal. One of the key things to remember is that formal is illegal. Okay? Collusion that is informal, they just happen to be, following the price of other firms, that is not necessarily illegal. So it's really difficult for the authorities to work out whether it is formal or informal. And then competition. So oligopolies, how do they conduct themselves? They collude or they compete, and then, as I say, you get this wonderful thing called game theory, which will be another video, which sits between those two options. Firms are competing and then they're colluding. Okay, and sometimes they will compete with each other and then they decide that actually that was stupid, and so they go back to collude. Sometimes it's an unstable equilibrium, and we'll look at that in the game theory. But game theory can either be used, as I say, for analysis or for evaluation, or for both, and it's really worthwhile bringing in game theory to your essays on oligopoly. So hopefully that's given you an introduction to oligopoly. You now need to go on to the next video and look at collusion, how that works, why that's beneficial for firms and beneficial for consumers, and the drawbacks of collusion as well, before you get on to the competition. So hopefully that's a good introduction to oligopoly for you.